Hi everybody, do let me know when you can see, and of course indeed, hear me. You may hear the road traffic. Hello, who have we got on? We've got Tish on, we've got Susan, we've got Patricia, Natalie from the Netherlands. How lovely to see. Just let me know if you can see and hear me. Okay, hello Leslie. Congratulations on your anniversary, all clear. Anyway, I helped respond to your post earlier, but felt like the wrong reaction to surgery, but here's to good health and many more years of it. Excellent, looking good, sounding well. My hair's a bit of a mess. I just noticed that I should have attended to that before I set off, but thankfully it won't be on me for very long. As little as I can do with on me. 27th of May. Oh, I thought I read it was 6 years. Anyway, I must have misread that, Leslie. Hello, Casey. I'm lovely to see you. Thank you very much. So, what a great start. But all the tradition, just thinking, well, in that case, you better mind how you get on. No, I'm responding to your. Anyway, Trisha, whatever your sobriquet is, I'll have it. Hello, Nikki. It's nice to have you on board, and our lovely friend Casey. I'm from Nashville in Tennessee. Lovely blue skies behind me. Yorkshire Day today, which I thought I'd kind of do something for that. So, but lots of kind of things in York kind of going on. But I thought I'm going to kind of take a bit of a sort of sideways. I'll tell you in a sec what I've kind of got up my sleeve, because I've got long sleeves on, which is a kind of clue, because we may be walking in amongst brambles and bits and pieces. So I thought I'd better wear a scratch-proof outfit, and that's what you took us to Askham Bog. Oh, I see. I do again. Right, I'm with you. Yes, sorry, that's what I was referring to. You're up. Yes. About 2 years ago we were last here, Leslie, but it's just reopened. It was shut for, maybe about 9 months. Open last Saturday. But I didn't want to come down then because there was a whole bunch of sort of stuff on for the community. I didn't want to kind of get in the way and be filming lots of people and children and everything. So I thought I'd wait till this week. So yes, it's just reopened. But yes, haven't been down here for quite some time, and I think we came a bit early, didn't we? Because what do you call those? Those lovely marsh lilies, really beautiful yellow flowers, were in full flow. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. We're going to sort of see the same place today, but with some different narrative. And so Catherine's on, hopefully pen in hand. So we're not quite at 5 o'clock, so we'll wait. Linda joined us as well. Fabulous. Hello, Linda. How nice to have so many familiar faces on Live at 5. So I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I think we'll begin. We'll take it from there. So, greetings one and all. Fran, if I haven't said hello to you up till now, as I want to see your name, I will say hello, but I think I've kind of covered most of them. Diane's here as well. Diane reads it. Diane's with us as well, which is lovely. Carolyn. And so lots of lovely faces that we recognise, and hopefully one or two new ones. Who knows? We'll find out. The usual suspects, well behaved. So no whispering at the black, no passing notes. There will be a test at the end. So do pay attention to today's action. My microphone's a bit loud there. We're going to the red, so I'll just move that down a little bit, because I don't want to be blasting you all with volume. So hopefully that is a better kind of level. Good. So we're beginning our Yorkshire Day walk today here on the edge of the A64, which I'm going to flick over. Not the most glamorous of locations, but there's method in my madness. I'll tell you why in a sec. This is a road that's carried people and goods between York and the Yorkshire coast. So think of it as a link road between York and the Yorkshire coast since the Roman times. And what looks like an ordinary kind of modern highway actually sits on top of a glacial moraine, a raised ridge of debris left behind at the end of the last ice age. That's what we're going to talk about today, how the ice age changed this area and created where we are now. So a moraine is the kind of rubble, really, that a glacier drags and bulldozes across the landscape. Think of all those millions of tons of pressure that lets you drag all this stone and kind of rubbish and detritus across the landscape. What it leaves behind, these ridges, these moraines, and we're sort of sat on top of one of them here. So it's soil, it's stones, it's boulders, and everything's kind of been scraped from the ground, creating the big valleys, the dales, and it keeps moving until the ice melts. And then when the ice melts, where it kind of stays is the new landscape. So rivers kind of build deltas from silt, and glaciers build moraines from whatever they kind of grind through. So when the last glaciers retreated, this ridge remained as a kind of dry spine of what was otherwise a vast waterlogged fen, which we're heading down now. And it's kind of not the natural shape of the land at all. Beneath our feet, we've got, ancient Triassic and Jurassic stones, but none of that's visible. The glacial deposits completely bury the original sort of bedrock. So this kind of raised ground here has guided travellers for thousands of years, from Roman soldiers, medieval traders, and obviously the traffic now passing us by. And it's a starting point for our walk into a landscape that's older, of course, than the road itself. So Leslie's got a glacial moraine near you, North Heights, London. I mean, this is it. There are so many of them because ultimately it's just whenever the ice stopped or it got to a stage where the temperature was rising out to melt, it begins to drop. And obviously once that happens, you get a drag factor. You've got, what's the word I'm looking for? Friction, haven't you? So everything stops moving so fast, you get this build up. And so these ridges. But because this was a dry line, if we kind of go down a couple of miles to where I live down there, you've got drying houses. It's from the term drying houses because it was an area above this waterlogged landscape where you could dry animal skins. So anyway, that's right. So we're going to get down to Askham Bog now. I say it's just recently reopened, and we're here on Yorkshire Day. So Yorkshire Day apparently has been around about 40 years. We might see some cows, some dexters. I should stop north of your house. But it's been very warm. It's been the warmth of your personality, Leslie. Has kept it at bay ever since. So we may see some cows today. But as I say, this has just reopened the Askham Bog after, I think our gimbal's going, so I may have to just sort that, but see how we get on. So it's just reopened as this nature reserve after about 9 months being sort of shut down. But this ancient bogland we're coming into now occupies the site of an ancient lake that was left behind by the retreating glacier. So on one side you've got all the rubble kind of built up, on the other all the water melts. So you've got a valley, fills with water, and that of course then gradually drains and becomes a wetland. So that lake formed around 15,000 years ago, which incidentally is kind of pretty much the exact same moment that the earliest patterns of human settlement begin to appear in Britain after the last ice age. So it's a landscape born in meltwater, emerging just as people were returning to the British Isles. And it remains one of the oldest surviving habitats in Yorkshire. We're not quite onto it yet. So just, let's be clear on this, the oldest habitat, okay? So it's not the oldest landscape in Yorkshire, of course, we've got stones that are hundreds of millions of years old. But if we think about much of the country's geology, it's much older. But the difference here is that the habitat is largely unchanged since those earliest settlers arrived. So while uplands, like the Dales, were kind of later shaped by farming, grazing and human cultivation, boglands preserve a fragment of a kind of post-glacial world in something close to its original form. So Askham Bog preserves the character of that early world. Wetland pools, fen edges, birch and willow scrub, and the slow accumulation of peat. Hello, Poppy. So walking here, and we're sort of just starting to come in as we come around the corner, we'll start coming into the wetlands. And it's rather dry at the moment, it's a rather dry wetland. But it lets us see Yorkshire not as it became, but as it first appeared when humans arrived after the last ice age. And as we walk, it's worth remembering that this landscape tells a story of human adaptation. So that's what I thought I'd sort of focus on today. The people of Yorkshire, because kind of Yorkshire Day is an interesting concept. Been around apparently since the 1980s, but born out of a kind of 1970s I think actually, but born out of a kind of an objection to local government, redrawing of lines and suddenly bits that were in Yorkshire not in Yorkshire anymore. And then so it sort of grew with a little bit of a chip on its shoulder, named after, although the date is related to a very, very kind of obscure battle, 1759, the Battle of Minden. I think you could stop 100 Yorkshire people and none of them would know about the Battle of Minden. Not even in this country, it was in is it France or Germany, northwest Germany. So it's kind of it's obscure kind of reference. And often we'll kind of use this kind of Yorkshire Day as being about this kind of ideas of what Yorkshire is. But those ideas to me always seem to come from outside, external ideas. So I thought, well, let's go back to the beginning, even before the beginning, because really, in many ways, the beginning is here. If you look at that. Tacitus on Britain and Germany, the Agricola and Germanica is its proper title. That's the English translation. Tacitus, Roman historian, came with his father-in-law, Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain, and wrote basically horrible things about people of the north. How mean and kind of inward and nasty we were. I'll take back to that. Isn't that nice? This is just part of the new decking out of this area. So celebrating the 80-year anniversary of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. This is managed and owned by them. Isn't that nice? Come around this side so you can see the... Yeah, James Herriot's fabulous. And I think that's a wholly nice idea of Yorkshire. But of course it portrays lots of mean farmers, doesn't it? They don't want to pay for things. And so forth. He does somewhat play up Mr. Alfwhite, who's from Glasgow. It should be noticed, of course, the vet. You know, to some of these stereotypes of Yorkshiremen being a bit careful with the cash. Should we put it that way? Isn't it lovely? So I thought, yeah, we'll go back to the beginning. Yeah, before even Tacitus could do a number on us and describe us as exactly disparaging Yorkshire, getting in a kind of a low-sell Argentinian tackle on the northern boys. They did think we were barbarians, David. So I thought we'd go back a bit, like a long way really, because you know, even here in York, we're so proud of saying 2,000 years of history, which is absolutely correct, insofar as we've got 2,000 years of Roman history, or will be in another 30 years. But it rather kind of ignores everything that's happening here before. There's thousands of years of what happened here before. So that's what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about the first people of Yorkshire. That seemed to be a pretty decent idea for Yorkshire Day, something I've already talked about before. So there we go. So the people who first came into Yorkshire arrived during profound climate change. Rapid warming, rising sea levels, shifting vegetation, and the disappearance of the great Ice Age animals. It is very much like a totem, isn't it? So, you know, without labouring the point too much, I'm sure you can see the parallel there, that the period of time we're talking about was a period of aggressive climate change where people were being forced to adapt very, very quickly. And no doubt, you know, kind of felt that you know, the world was kind of turning rather too fast for them. So they had to adjust these new conditions, find new resources and new ways of living. But they did so with remarkable resilience. So this bogland we're starting to come into now is largely unchanged since these earliest arrivals. So we can step into the world of theirs. It reminds us that Yorkshire's story has always been about people responding to a changing environment. So you'll see at the end of this stone path here, we're about to go onto a walkway. And the walkway is because under normal circumstances, if you walk on the other side, you would have very wet ankles indeed. I think last time I came I wore wellies and kind of squelched around. This time I kind of won't need to do that because obviously I've had so much drought. But it's still, of course, a wetland. So that's why if you see here, we're just about to walk onto the path here. We're stepping into now proper of the Ice Age, the bogland rather. So the kind of last glacial period which created this stretched from about 115,000 years ago to roughly 11,700 years ago. And it's part of what they call the Paleolithic age. Now, I've been guiding long enough to know that when you use words like Paleolithic, people start going, what, I've heard of it, I don't know what that is. So let's start on the kind of basics. The easy way of describing it is, it's the Stone Age. Now, everyone's heard of the Stone Age, right? But when was the Stone Age? The trouble with the Stone Age is, whilst everyone gets immediately what you're kind of talking about, it lasts about 3 million years. So historians or prehistorians have this idea to break it into 3 periods. And they use the Greek terms. Paleo meaning old, meso meaning middle, and neo meaning new. Lithic means relating to stone. So Paleolithic means the old Stone Age and so on. So as we use these terms, Mesolithic today, Neolithic, I'll just keep reminding you, it just means, you know, Paleo is the oldest, Meso is the middle, Neo is the youngest, but it's all the Stone Age. The Stone Age, in effect, ends at the end of the last Ice Age. Can you see the cows over here? We may step over and take you a little bit closer. Woolly mammoths, all that indeed. So the retreat of the last Ice Age across the British Isles was very slow underneath. There's people coming out and let them get by. The southern England thawed first, so Leslie's part of the world. So for thousands of years before people could move north into what is Yorkshire, they were able to settle, live, flourish, hunt in the south. So this kind of staggered retreat is what makes Askham Bog so significant. It's older than human settlements in the region. And it's one of the few habitats in Britain that still preserves a landscape from before people arrived. Putting aside the golf course, but the golf course is on the side of the moraine, to be fair to them. So we've got 48 hectares, I believe, here. So humans began returning to the British Isles around 15,200 years ago as the great ice sheet finally began to withdraw. So we'll go and see the cows. So their movement northwards coincided with a sharp rise in summer temperatures. Again, see these parallels. It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. A sudden warming that transformed the environment within decades. Sounds all familiar? Okay. So I'm not saying any of this, by the way, that's nothing to do with climate change, but rather it's the causes of climate change rather than is climate change a thing, I think, is everyone's argument. Look at some cows here. There's Marianne with us. Isn't that wonderful? So we've got some woolly, less woolly mammoths, but mammoths all on. And of course, they're very happy, and this breed are particularly resilient. A lot of cattle would get foot rot living in an environment like this. This is a breed that is particularly tolerant of that. So as ever, there is always in nature an adaptive species, isn't there? Whether there's a plant that doesn't mind having wet feet, because most plants would hate having wet roots, others absolutely lap it up. Most cows will get foot rot, you have to take them out. This lot are adapted and it's okay. So if we're going back to this period at the end of the Ice Age, I'm going to put this here and we'll just look at the cows. I'll take what Liam was showing you in a minute. So Britain is still connected to the European mainland at this stage, this 15,000 years ago. And so these early groups of people were following herds of reindeer and wild horses who were migrating into newly opened ecosystems where fresh grazing had appeared. So just like these cows are doing, as it melts, it kind of reveals new... Because the other thing, of course, that glaciers did, but they were brilliant planting, is they pulled up trees and everything in its path. When they began to settle back down again, they dumped all this stuff. So it's like a reseeding. It's kind of very interesting, really, kind of how glaciers really did transform landscapes. So after the Ice Age ended, the climate in northwest Europe didn't kind of settle immediately. It saw between kind of warm and cold phases at least twice, with changes happening over surprisingly short periods. Hello, Ronnie. So the people who had entered Yorkshire were doing so into a world that was rapidly shifting around them. Rising temperatures, changing vegetation, new animals, and new opportunities. So Askham Bog gives us a glimpse of that moment, a kind of landscape formed in meltwater, emerging just as humans were adapting to profound environmental change. I don't think I'm going to go over there because there's a few too many cows. So I was umming and ahhing about going and seeing them, but there's quite a lot on ditches, and so I don't want to get trapped on the barbed wire. So kind of recent research focuses on dramatic climate transitions in the late Paleolithic period, which is about 14 to 11,000 years ago, this kind of switch of temperatures. In northwest Europe, including the land that would become the British Isles, humans repeatedly abandoned regions during such sudden cold phases, and then returned just as abruptly when the temperatures kind of warmed up. So fossil evidence shows people moving to wherever conditions support their survival. And the archaeological record reveals a kind of clear pattern. A sharp rise in temperature as the ice melted, followed by a rapid re-emergence of plant life, then animals moving into new grazing grounds, and finally humans arriving in the wake of their prey. So reindeers and wild horses were the key species drawing people northwards. And around 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, humans entered Yorkshire again. Now, they weren't the first people to ever set foot here, but they were the first for more than 100,000 years. So early human species had lived in Britain long before the glaciation. So we're going to do a loop. This kind of loop goes all the way around. We'll go this way, I think, first, and look at the lake. And as I say, I'll just show you again. So Leslie was saying how wet it was last time. You can see we've got wetter land here. It's muddy, but in essence, it's dry, which is a real kind of concern. So, as I say, they had lived in Britain, but pretty much everything was in the south of England. So what we saw is in this archaeological record is a long absence followed by a return. So as the ice cap kind of shrank back from northern England, new land opened up and vegetation established itself. Animals move into the fresh grazing and the humans follow the animals to hunt them as prey. Does that kind of make sense? It sort of seems obvious when you think about it, doesn't it? But these kind of patterns of migration and settlement really are absolutely driven by the temperature, by the climate, and livability. Where in a place you can live. That's fine. So let's pop into the woods and have a first kind of glimpse of what this looks like. As I say, because it's quite dry at the minute, it's quite easy for you to walk in. But when it's in full moist mode, this is absolutely squelching. You're going to lose your shoes. But this is what ancient British woodland, Jennifer, looks like. Kind of, there's only certain species that can grow in these boglands, so that you don't get an awful lot of different variety. You get huge amounts of ferns. Ferns, of course, one of the oldest plants. And ferns, of course, are highly unusual insofar as they don't flower. They have seeds, if you look on the back of those, that drop. They don't need pollinating. They kind of cross-pollinate, or self-pollinate is probably a better word. So this really is the landscape that would have greeted the people as the ice sheets kind of came away. You just got this very, very dense forestation, relatively new, of course, because it hadn't had a chance anything old had been smashed away by the glaciers. So like this, saplings, but growing so closely together that you can't see sky. There's no obvious paths. The floor is covered by plants that don't mind both wet feet, but also not a lot of light through the canopy. So we can sort of say with a very, very high degree of certainty that you could have stood here 10,000 years ago and it would look pretty much identical. And there are very few places on the planet, other than standing in the middle of the Sahara, where you can say that. The fact that we've got one around our doorstep is amazing. And David Attenborough, no less, called this kind of a cathedral, of nature, insofar as that because it stayed in the same way as an ecosystem, it supports so many things that simply can't live elsewhere. Exactly, you can't see the wood for the trees. And what would human settlement do? They'd come in, Leslie, wouldn't they? And they'd start coppice, they'd start cutting down, creating pathways, building houses, all these. So exactly what we've all done throughout our history. But this is what it looks like when you don't do that. When you don't, look, there's no paths. I'm deliberately just not going kind of too far in, but just to kind of give you that sense, really, of, of take the humans out, and this is what it kind of looks like. You don't get this managed environment. You get I think it's nice, isn't it? But you get this much more organic environment. And as I say, you get plants and animals that are able to kind of cope with these, what for some animals and plants would be extreme conditions. Most plants in your garden, that are great for flowering, would hate it here. They'd just die, they'd give up. Try overwatering your pots and you kind of find out what I mean. It's most plants don't like this environment. So consequently, it becomes an incredibly dense, rich mix of plants to do. But oak trees are one of the ones that can cope. And absolutely, Leslie's right, there's very, very little of this ancient woodland left. So ancient woodland plus bogland together, it's rare as hen's teeth. As I say, we're so fortunate to have it here. And unsurprisingly, when they wanted to build a lot of new houses not too far away from here, not so long ago, there was a big campaign. They were blocked and stopped. David Attenborough got involved, bless him. Shouldn't he be our president? Or, and not a king, obviously, but whatever he's, while he's still here, we should honour him and treasure him. But he got involved, spearheaded the campaign, and of course, it was all knocked back. And so, thank you, Fran. Thus, it was kind of protected for more generations. And as I say, this has just opened up this kind of new walkway on here. Look at the little one I'm going to film in. But so lovely to see families down here enjoying this environment. But as I say, this is what it looks like before the people arrived. So this wetland predates human settlement. We're looking at a landscape escaped by the last ice age when it was to be too cold to live here. That's when these kind of wetlands were created. So the arrival of kind of people is the beginnings of kind of human history in this part of Britain. All these reeds, by the way. So again, these old plants, that can quite happily live with wet feet. So after 100,000 years of absence, this land then was shaped entirely by the rhythms of the climate and the opportunities created in that kind of changing environment. So as the Ice Age ends and the temperatures rise, sea levels climbed worldwide. As you'd expect, a lot of meltwater, sea's going to go up, right? You've got to go somewhere. We can't get rid of matter, can we? That's a principle of physics, isn't it? You can't destroy matter. You can't destroy water either. Makes you wonder what happens in drought. Where does that water go? I was thinking about that today. 8% of water? Does it rain about 8% of what we should have had last month? 8%, so 92% of the water. Where is it? No idea. And obviously in Britain then, this had a dramatic effect. It flooded low-lying ground, so East Anglia, Essex, a lot of Lincolnshire. All this area was then reclaimed. Netherlands, of course, reclaimed in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, was all underwater. And it turned what had been a peninsula of Europe into the islands we recognise today. So at the start of the Mesolithic period, so we're going to use the word method again, to a Middle Stone Age, Britain was still connected to the continent by a land bridge known as Doggerland, which is now submerged beneath the North Sea. So I've got an image just to help you kind of get a sense of that. So imagine this really like as call it an ice sheet if you like, all that kind of greenery, or think of it, do you know what I mean, a solid doesn't really matter. It was so dense you could live on it, you could walk on it. But we didn't have that island shape that we're so used to in Great Britain. It just didn't exist because you just got this entire sort of plateau of land. So when the glaciers melted and the water levels rose, this sank. The ice melted, so the big ice bridge, in effect, was no more. And so consequently, we then go back to being an island. And of course, what that means is, of course, is that anything that had wandered over here, any animals that had wandered over here for past grazing, well, they were now stuck here. So around 9,600 BC, it was a kind of low-lying plain crossed by rivers and rich in food resources. But as the meltwater poured into the oceans, Doggerland gradually flooded, and by about 5,500 BC, the land bridge had completely disappeared, creating the English Channel and isolating the islands, the Channel Islands, another one that would have popped up at that period, the Isle of Wight. So sea level rise, of course, wasn't always slow. A lot of people would have been kind of caught out pretty quickly. So take a bit more walking in the woodlands because it's just so nice, isn't it? So around this is an interesting one that I found out that'll blow your mind if you don't already know. Around 6,000 BC, 6,200 BC, there was a massive submarine landslide off Norway, and it triggered a tsunami that crashed into Scotland and the east coast of England, the eastern coast. But get this, the result, the debris of that tsunami, some 8,200 years ago, dumped silt all on the north and east coast of England, which is the sand. So our beaches were created almost in a day by a tsunami off Norway. Isn't that crazy? I never knew that. Did anybody know that? I read that and I thought, that can't be right. So yeah, it's fascinating, fascinating. So for these kind of methodistic groups, these Middle Stone Age groups living on those shores, it must have been a catastrophic event, a single event reshaping the coastline, sweeping away settlements. So deep layers of these sands still in place remind us of when the landscape was changing rapidly and people had to adapt to new conditions, new resources, and of course, new dangers. So I say the Mesolithic, we've got early and late, so early and late middle. So the early bit follows immediately after the Ice Age during rapid warming when summer temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees. Isn't it lovely? And again, I can get a walk further in, but you can just see that it's just not demarked by paths. It is entirely wild. So even so, the climate was still cool by kind of modern standards, resembling kind of tundra giving way to open forest. So the first forests were dominated by fast colonising species such as birch and hazel. And so much of this was done by the glacial planting. As that kind of stone and organic debris began to be dumped, of course, wherever it's been dumped, it's then got water. It's obviously becomes a wet and drain land. So consequently, it begins to grow. But it was a drier climate than today, but still markedly colder, and the vegetation reflected a world in transition. So these open forests and grasslands provided habitats for a wide range of animals, including several now extinct species known as megafauna. So aurochs, anybody heard of aurochs? Janie might, it's a Scottish sounding word, were the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, and they roamed these early woodlands. alongside Megasaurus, giant deer, with antlers spanning more than 3 metres, and elk. So I've actually got an image of an aurochs skeleton, so you'll see quite how closely it resembles. So had you been here 8, 9, 10,000 years ago, you may well have come across one of these wandering through. Aurochs, yes. So aurochs were a predecessor of the kind of cows that we've just seen around the corner a minute ago. Also, herds of red deer and wild horses moved through clearings, while smaller animals like pine martens were abundant. But predators were present too. Bear and wolf hunted across this landscape. And by this period, dogs had already been domesticated. One of the striking examples comes in Star Carr, which is Scarborough, or the end of the A64, where remains of early domesticated dogs have been found. Their presence hints at a kind of close relationship between humans and animals in the Mesolithic period, a kind of partnership that helped people navigate a world still settling after the Ice Age. In the kind of later Mesolithic period, the climate becomes wetter and warmer. So at that point, lime and oak trees, linden trees, oak trees, we saw an oak tree, didn't we? So I can see a lime for you while we're here. So they spread across lowlands, creating much denser forest canopy, and these thicker woodlands allowed far less light to reach the forest floor, reducing grasses in the undergrowth that the grazing animals depended upon. So consequently, fewer animals came for hunting opportunities. In contrast, the poorer soils of the uplands supported lighter birch, ash and pine woodland, rich in both plant and animal resources. So, you know, the density of the growth impacts the ability of the animal to feed. So consequently, the animal chooses to go and hunt in easier areas, so that, you know, the planting of the glaciers is then affect animal behaviour, which in turn then patterns of settlement and so forth. So everything is related, as we're saying, isn't it? Ecosystems, yeah. So consequently, in this kind of wetland, you wouldn't have had kind of herds of red deer and wild horses. It wouldn't have kind of suited them, too dense. And of course, the other thing is as well, is imagine you are a deer and you are looking out for your predator, a wolf or a bear. Would you want to be in there, where consequently, do you know what I mean, that you can be surprised, you can be pounced on, you can be peered, or would you prefer to be on a nice open plain somewhere where you've got kind of sight lines for perhaps 300 or 400 feet? Okay, so if something comes at you, you've got a chance to run. You start running through this, you're going to trip, you're going to fall, it's boggy, it's not ideal. So it becomes self-selecting for the species to decide whether this environment is suitable for them. And of course, dogs are already being kind of used for hunting. Dogs are particularly brilliant in this kind of landscape and kind of chase down animals. So it becomes, as I say, kind of self-selecting, and you get less and less variety. But interestingly, what that does is then the animals that are here, the poo that they kind of put down, you know, is particularly suited to the plants that like these kind of rich, boggy landscapes. So as time goes on, it becomes a richer and richer stew. Does this kind of make sense? I hope this kind of makes sense, what I'm trying to tell you. It becomes a richer and kind of richer stew of not so much full biodiversity, but concentrated biodiversity. Do you know what I mean? So that everything that likes this environment does so well here that it's very, very difficult then for other plants and species to kind of work their way through. So yes, but dogs, as I say, about 10,000 years, as I say, we've been hanging out together, which is rather nice. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be in the woods to get eaten. Yeah, you definitely want to be somewhere, Janie, you know, where you had a bit of a shot, you know, at kind of getting out of there. So I think dogs, you know, humans really help them to kind of settle into this kind of period of change. And also, of course, in the thicker wood, you've got far less light. So it's also harder for humans to see as well, for hunting. So consequently, the smaller species began to dominate the woodlands. So you did get a lot of roe deer, fox and wild boar, because they like eating the acorns of spreading oak. So as the acorns grew, as the oak trees grew rather, acorns become this kind of very kind of widely available kind of food source. And so, of course, the wild boar that loves nothing more than an acorn. And it said, of course, isn't it, that the meat of wild boar, so in France a lot, you know, it's kind of shaped by acorn, and incredible sort of flavour that you get. There's nothing else of an animal that simply lived on acorn. Now let's kind of wander into this bit here. I'll go back on the path in a minute, but just kind of show you again how undisturbed it is. But these, I'm sort of struggling to find anywhere I can work through that I'm not going to trample these ferns, because they grow so densely together. But again, it's such a lovely opportunity because it's dry to take you kind of fairly deep into the bogland. If you just see, it's sort of almost monospecies by the time we get into here, as you can see. You know, we've just got ferns. There are some grasses that are kind of poking above, but overwhelmingly, it's kind of ferns. So, some species like wild horses just couldn't survive here in heavy woody conditions. And so, you know, we've kind of got this sort of concentration, really, of plants and animals around here that that were suited to this environment. And of course, you know, from a human point of view, when you're hunting and gathering food, anything, and it's for animals as well, anything that kind of requires less energy and labour, you know, is a better return for you. If you have to sort of run for 6 hours to catch an animal, you better catch it, otherwise you're going to be exhausted and you're not going to make it home, you're going to die. So consequently, you know, finding environments where you get that kind of meet your sweet spot and being able to either gather food. So, you know, it does seem that, you know, the arrival of farming, which happens at the sort of very back end of the Mesolithic period, you know, is a kind of trade-off. At what point does the effort of farming, so obviously staying in one place, cultivating land, understanding the seasons, irrigation, all these kind of things, at what point does that trade-off begin to work? That there's less effort involved in farming than there is in kind of moving around, particularly if you understand the nature of the seasons, and you kind of know where you can go to take advantage of kind of seasonal abundance. So if you know where salmon are at a certain time of year, if you know where nut harvests are and migrating herds, then, you know, there's every argument to say it's actually worth sort of being continually kind of migratory, isn't it, as a population, as a tribe. But at the point where those resources would be too far away, it takes too much energy to get there, or when you do get there, it's too uncertain, it's too difficult to catch them or to harvest them. At that point, it makes sense to go, okay, well, let's start farming. Let's kind of put down some roots. So what we're talking about here are people that weren't aimless wanderers. They knew the kind of landscapes intimately, and that there's lots of evidence of hunting in the archaeological record. Obviously, animal bones are found on a number of Mesolithic sites, Mesolithic rather. Flints and antler tools very much more common. So animals would have been hunted by bows and arrows, or spears with their tips set with tiny stone flakes, microliths, filled with natural resins and bindings made from plant stems, hide, or sinew. So again, it wasn't simply picking up a stone and throwing it. They'd become expert, you know, at creating the tools that they knew were going to do the job. At the end of the day, you've got to have something that can penetrate an animal hide. Now, obviously, leather is treated to make it tougher, but at the end of the day, that's what a cow hide is leather, isn't it? So, you know, you're not going to just be able to penetrate it with no effort. You need to be able to develop tools that can do the job, and of course, do the job quickly. Otherwise, the animal is going to get away or attack you or whatever. So, any animal caught was a valuable source of meat and of course materials as well. So fur, hide and sinew provided clothing and binding. So sinew, of course, you know, between the muscles, it's like the tendons, isn't it? The bits that kind of hold muscles to bones. They could kind of be dried out, and then they were used for kind of tying things together, very, very kind of strong. Antler and bone were shaped as tools. Bladders and stomachs could become containers. So Mesolithic hunters had an intimate knowledge of animal behaviour, seasonality and habit. And there's evidence they managed the landscape by selectively burning patches of woodland. And obviously by selectively burning patches, you're creating an absence. So you start to create a shortage of grazing. So it forces the animals into another area where it's easy for you guys to kind of hide yourselves, work as a team, bring them down, you know. And this is, as I say, at this stage, it was easier to hunt than it was to farm. So I'm talking about, you know, the history of Yorkshire here, really. I'm not just talking just about Askham Bog, just to be kind of absolutely clear. And we're just talking about the early settlements, really, of Yorkshire. So for Yorkshire Day, we talk about Yorkshire people before they even knew the name of Yorkshire, before York was even imagined, before the Romans, any of this stuff, with people here living in the north of England, in Yorkshire, and that's what we're talking about today. So fish are the sea creature important. There's a pond down here, so let's talk about what lived in the waters. So winkles, limpets, whelks, crabs were available down the coast. How do we know that? Then we find the shells, of course. You know, the beauty of archaeology is so much of it is rubbish, isn't it? You know, it is, you know, it's finding yesterday's rubbish, yesterday's detritus, or more helpfully, thousands of years ago's rubbish, And what can we draw from that? And we know that if we've got, a huge dump, of clamshells, we pretty obviously ate clams, right? They're going to collect the shells because they're pretty. So consequently, archaeology and these pits, where you find loads of bones and horns, antlers, that tells us a lot about hunting, doesn't it? You find lots of bone chippings and combs. It tells you they're using bone to transform it into other things, into tools that you can kind of use and so forth. So, everything in archaeology is about, developing more understanding, using the kind of the record and the deposits to say, okay, what can we now derive, from this information? So some guys just sort of sat over here. So we'll have a wander further into the woods, and we'll come back and have a look at the pond. So we're not filming them. So hunters likely travelled on rivers and coastal waters in simple log or kind of skin boats like curricles. So that was a very easy way to travel by water, because it's a lot easier to travel. We'll come back in a couple of minutes. We'll come into the woods. It's a lot easier to travel on water than it is to travel on land, where there's simply no paths and there's no roads. So fish would have been caught with bone hooks, or 2 or 3 pronged harpoons with these microliths on the end. These are very, very sharp little spikes. And nets were probably used, but that's probably more for inshore fishing than for sea fishing. A wide range of plants would have been used in their diets, including nuts, fruits, berries, fungi, leaves and roots. And again, it's seeds and so forth that are found in the archaeological record that tells us this stuff. Plants and timbers were also used. Medicines, dyes, poisons. We know about what was used for making rope, baskets, bedding, weapons and shelters. Let's have a wander into here. And the kind of this part really of life was deeply dependent, of course, on seasons. But of course, plant materials rarely survive archaeology. But what they do is, of course, within fossils, you kind of get seeds. Things like amber, of course, things get kind of trapped in. So there are ways that you can get this kind of flora and fauna. And of course, in the case of York, with Vikings, a bit later on, but of course, human poo. You can preserve that. You can tell about diet and so forth. So we're not at all clear on what the diet was in the Mesolithic period, this Middle Stone Age period. And until kind of recently, the view was that people lived mainly in kind of temporary shelters covered with animal skins, the kind of classic sort of Stone Age idea. But over the last decade, several house sites have been found that appear to be semi-permanent. And Scarborough, North Yorkshire, is kind of at the forefront of the Tees Valley of this kind of discovery. So Mesolithic camps high in the North Yorkshire moors were unlikely to have been continuously occupied, but hearths were built and reused over extended periods. In other words, you can see they're going to be carbon fires. So maybe they were there for certain parts of the year, where it could sustain livelihoods, and then move on somewhere else, for different seasons, then kind of come back the following winter. So it is quite magnificent, isn't it, the Viking turd, Janie? Too beautiful to flush, you obviously thought 1,000 years ago. So we can look at this kind of record of saying that there's been fires there over and over and over again, but with kind of gaps in between. So hearths are kind of really good way. So at Carr, which is up near Scarborough, sorry, timber platforms are constructed on the edge of a lake. And at least one of the buildings dates to around 9,000 BC. That's 11,000 years ago, isn't it? Shade over 11,000 years ago. So Carr is particularly important for its preservation of timber, bone animal antlers, which reveal far more about Mesolithic life than the stone tools alone. Now, I've got a picture here that was done by Scarborough Museums Trust. It's very nice. Just gives you an idea of what they think that Carr would kind of look like as a settlement. And as you can see, that's no mere animal skin, is it? Kind of stretched across. Kind of frame. This is not a kind of temporary shelter, is it? I mean, that is fairly sad. Like I say, they might not have been there all year. The river won't come up and meant they could only be there for certain months a year. But as you can see, obviously it's wetland. You can see with the reeds up there. So we've got a very similar kind of environment to where we are now. And perhaps there for 3, 4, 6 months a year. But they're coming back. They're returning. You see them drying skins up on the kind of rail over there from the animal kills and so forth. So yeah, Viking poo, Ronnie, was found in Lloyd's Bank Trench, 1975 in York. It's known as the Viking turd. So, like I say, this sort of sense that it was just people, rootless people, just being there for a week or two, hunting, moving on, not true. So objects found at these sites include headdresses made from red deer skulls, and frontlets made with antlers, points, amber and shale beads, and even a wooden paddle. And these items hint at a world in which practical tools, personal adornment and ritual objects were all part of daily life. So beliefs and rituals probably vary from place to place and changed over the 6,000 years of this period. Rituals performed near coasts and rivers may have differed from those carried out on the high ground. And Mesolithic people liked a rich folklore shared through storytelling, which is what we still have, of course. So archaeological evidence for Mesolithic ritual is scarce, but at Star Carr, once again, they found a number of stag frontlets and modified and perforated so they could be worn on the head. Coprolite, yes, of course, that's the proper word, the proper term, but turd is the word that is frequently used. The purpose is unknown, but they suggest ceremonial behaviour. I'll bring it up and you sort of see what I'm talking about here. So this is found up at Scarborough, and you can see exactly what it is, the eye holes. You know, this is some kind of shamanic, isn't it, headdress. So this is a real insight now into the culture of the people in this Middle Stone Age period, 11,000 years ago or so, living, 40 miles away from where we are now, probably using the route, the highland, to get across to York, or this area, this valley where we're in now. You know, probably identifying, maybe praying to the souls of the animals, to thank them for feeding them or whatever, but some degree of animorphization, is that kind of word? I think you'll kind of know what I'm talking about there, but isn't that stunning? That we can look at this, and know that somebody put that on their head and performed some kind of ritual, some kind of celebration, 10,000, 11,000 years ago in this very area. It really does make it a bit rich when we sort of say York's got a 2,000-year history. And I can understand why they do, because it's a really good marketing slogan to say, come and see Roman history. But to suggest that's all there is, really is doing the people a disservice. So we don't know if they're using hunting disguises, or obviously you could do that, couldn't you, if you were sort of trying to make your way through the forest, your antlers, but pretty more likely ritual. There's very few Methodistic burials known from the British Isles, but quite a few of them are in this area. Often showing evidence that bodies were decomposed before burial, which is kind of interesting. Would have terrified you, wouldn't it, David? I think so. Yeah? So on the coastline of North Yorkshire, bodies are placed in shallow marshes or bogs, possibly in salt water, and it's possible this tradition evolved from Mesolithic practices. So archaeological research suggests that this period's activity in Yorkshire differed between lowlands and uplands. What's really kind of interesting is the specificity. So lowlands, like down here, where it's all kind of waterlogged. Higher up on the kind of hillsides, the upland areas, where you get bigger animals and so forth, providing views across the land and across the coastal plain. But the higher ground, this is what's really interesting, is it tends to be focused between 350 and 400 metres above sea level, but with particular concentrations at 360 to 380 metres. So this narrow 20-minute range kind of defines the communities that these Middle Stone Age people like living in. Is that interesting? That should be so kind of defined. There's very, very little activity of anything above sort of 400 metres, or no evidence of it yet. That's what we should always say in archaeology. Thus far, there is no evidence to suggest. But this strong concentration of people living a few hundred metres above sea level. They like to, of course, be near watercourses, particularly spring heads. So, of course, where water comes to the surface, they're going to go on and become part of a river. They're the areas where you tend to get these kind of encampments. And, of course, what they've been able to do is take cores from peat deposits. Now, this is a peat bog. That's kind of part of what happens when it's all kind of underwater and the right acidic conditions. So they can carbon date stuff and examine surviving pollen, because pollen gets kind of trapped within there. And these samples from this area constantly contain charcoal, suggesting that Mesolithic people use fire as a tool to manipulate their environment, also to encourage fresh growth, and attracting grazing animals and maintaining open woodland. So this transition from hunter-gatherer communities to farming is difficult to pin down. What we've got before that is we've got evidence of landscape being measured, which I guess is a halfway house. You may only be there at certain times of the year rather than permanently resident in an area. But the fact that you are seeking to manage it by burning it, by controlling it, by digging peat and so forth, creating channels, creating irrigation, opening some areas up for grazing, suggests that we are on our way towards at least cultivation of the environment, if not kind of full-on farming. And this is probably a mixture of kind of local practices, but also the arrival of kind of new ideas. And of course, there's little intrinsically better about farming if the natural sources of food are abundant. So it isn't necessarily, farming in some respects, isn't it? It's about growing food where there isn't food. So if you've got lots of food in the first place, you wouldn't really kind of need to. Lots of brambles. Yeah, there's a few around, but more than lots of brambles. I'm looking, there's probably no paths. It's not difficult to find your way back to the edge of this, but finding where that stile was that I walked in a few minutes ago, because there's a family down there that's trying to avoid. So lots of food would have been available. So the strategies that they had for gathering food, didn't need to rely on farming as such at this stage. I think they're up there. Yeah, I think if I go over there. So during the 5,000 years sort of following the arrival of these first migrants, the climate steadily improved and richer vegetation covered the land. Now, birch was one of the first tree species to appear, followed by hazel, pine, elm, oak, and alder. So we start to get diversity in trees. I think that is probably what that's been built for, maybe. I'm not entirely sure, but they've clearly been doing some cutting back in the landscape, and they've created that's fabulous. So we also know, of course, that the coast is moving, that how far out the tide is going is changing, and of course we've got this continued melt. So by 5000 BC, Britain had become fully separated from mainland Europe, and later arrivals had to cross the Channel or the North Sea in dugout canoes. So the kind of remains of the ancient forests are sometimes dredged up from the bed of the North Sea. So as Leslie was saying, a lot of ancient forest has gone. A lot of that is because it got drowned out. So several phases of kind of Stone Age culture are represented in Yorkshire, and the tools and kind of weapons made of stone, bone, and antler, and even boar's tusk, can be seen in museums throughout the region. So, if you're coming here, places like the Yorkshire Museum and the Scarborough Museums Trust, a fantastic geological collection, there is all the physical evidence you could possibly want from this period. Lots of tiny, what they call pygmy flints, can be found in part of the Pennines, but they also found some brilliant ones in Stump Cross Cavern, which is in the Yorkshire Dales. It's a mine. I'll show you a picture of, and it just shows quite how sophisticated the working was. So that's found at Stump Cross. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, the shape of it is so well done. So these are created by people of this Middle Stone Age, known as Tardenoisians, after a district in Belgium. And there's all these kind of different groups. Yes, beavers definitely introduced back into the wild in Yorkshire, not in York itself, Fran, but certainly if you check out Yorkshire Wildlife Trust website, I'm sure there'll be a feature. So, just as we're now here by ourselves, you can see quite how low this water is. This, of course, not only should be a full pond, but we should have, water coming all the way. Isn't it really clever, really artistic? Now, around about 3000 BC, a revolutionary advance took place with the arrival of the first Neolithic settlers. So Neolithic, new Stone Age now. So Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, Neolithic, New Stone Age. Paleo, Meso, Neo. There, if you've learnt one thing today, hopefully that will kind of stay with you. All from the Greek, of course, as most things in academia are, including the word academia. So by this time, sort of 3000 BC, the North Sea and English Channel had assumed roughly their kind of present outline. So you'd kind of recognise the islands. So these people must have crossed in boats. The Neolithic Revolution brought arable farming and the domestication of animals. So Neolithic animals made pottery, wove cloth, and produced baskets. Permanent settlements were built, such as one like Ulrome, where a dwelling was constructed on wooden piles on the shore of a shallow lake, and that's been discovered. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Beneath the platform were found the bones of domestic animals, horses, pigs, sheep, and dogs. I'll just let you have a look at this while I chat away. You can see I saw a dragonfly yesterday. It's a hawker, but I saw a dragonfly. Not here, but it's said to be the sign of a very good environment if you can see dragonflies, because they are notoriously intolerant of bad environments. So underneath this kind of platform under the house, you've got all these animals, as well as wolves, bears, beavers. And nearby, in the village of Rudston, these settlers, these Neolithic people, erected the highest standing stone in the UK to hide anything at Stonehenge, known as a Rudston monolith. And you can still visit it today. In fact, it's bang next to a church, which is the strangest place you'd expect to see But there it is. See the graveyards next to it, but also you get a sense. Look at the height of the graveyards and the gravestones, I beg your pardon, and then look at the height of the Rudson monolith. So a 25-foot stone Neolithic monolith, about 20 miles or so from here. So Neolithic people buried their dead with ceremony, chambered in mounds known as barrows, both long and round barrows, loads of them in Yorkshire. And there's also some evidence of cremation. A place called Duggleby How, a large round barrow 20 feet high, is the largest kind in Britain. So I'll just get rid of Rudson. Picture's going to be thick and fast now. But the reason I'm kind of showing you this is because it's such a kind of concentration of Neolithic settlements is Yorkshire. Or maybe it's because they were all kind of built at the same time because this kind of land was being populated, suddenly available as the ice mass kind of went away, and suddenly you kind of got all this new area, new people kind of flooding in to settle in it, of course. One of the first things you have to do is what do you do with your dead and so forth. So a lot of this is getting established, and new places to kind of pray. So you kind of got the ritual stones, and this, that, and the other. So everything kind of fits in here, and we know that in there cremation was kind of taking place. So we're no longer just talking about burials. So another one like this at Willie Howe, funny, Willie Howe. So barrows are found across the wolds of East Yorkshire. There's some near Willoughby, near Filey, near Berrythorpe, another one. And it shows Neolithic communities held religious beliefs and probably believed in life after death. So I'll get rid of that feed. So some of those impressive prehistoric monuments are associated with a group of people who arrived in Britain around 2000 BC, and they were the megalith builders. So the Devil's Arrows, 3 piles of millstone grit, about 20 feet each. I'll show you that. Again, not too far away from here. I should do a tour of this, shouldn't I? But the trouble is they're all so far apart. You do one on a tour. This is near Boroughbridge, called the Devil's Arrows. So the gritstone is thought to have been transported from a quarry near Knaresborough, which of course we've been to. And the nearest kind of outcrop of similar gritstone is at Caton Base. It's unlikely you go all the way across to, that's Caton Base just near Scarborough, so it's unlikely you would have come from Scarborough, which will likely come from nearby Knaresborough. But of course, transportation of stones like this requires organisation, yeah? And it suggests that in late Neolithic and early Bronze Age times, you've kind of got a highly developed society. The use of bronze was introduced into Yorkshire by these new arrivals around 1800 BC. They're called the Beaker folk. Have you heard of the Beaker folk? Not Tracy Beaker, you may have heard of her, but the Beaker folk. And they got their name because we know they kind of came through the Pennines. They followed the York and Escric moraines. Their name comes from a habit of burying beaker-shaped urns with their dead. So here is one here. Look how beautifully decorated that is. So again, the more you kind of see stuff from these civilizations, the more it just seems completely unreasonable. We talk about 2,000 years of history. Why are we not celebrating the fact that we've got 11,000 years of history in this area? And that's what Starcar is trying to do. But for some reason, as storytellers, as tourism bodies, we're not really kind of supporting that message, which I think is a great shame, really. So beaker communities penetrate as far as Malham Moor, but generally they're on the Wolds side, the North Yorkshire moors and the eastern slopes of the Pennines, so certainly in this area. And the Yorkshire Museum here has got loads of examples of this pottery and stone and bronze ornaments and implements these farmers left behind. Aren't they lovely? So excavations show the evidence that they cultivated wheat. Obviously, again, what's it we find inside these? They also engaged in trade, importing flat bronze axes from Ireland and exporting Whitby jet ornaments. So Whitby, we've been to Whitby for ages, we couldn't go back to Whitby. So salt was another commodity they traded, may have had sea connections with Scandinavia. And we don't know really whether the transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age was a result of invasions, whether it's new people, whether it's technology evolved, whether it's stimulated by trade. But, we do get this transition. So whatever the mechanism, the arrival and adoption of bronze marked a significant shift in the cultural development of Yorkshire. The Beaker folk, in turn, were conquered by Celtic-speaking invaders who'd entered Gaul from the Mediterranean, who settled in Britain. So just remember this, when next time people talk about the British, who is it exactly that we're talking about? And I'm not having a dig, right, about population or race, but we do not have indigenous British people. We have a succession of people that came here and settled, some from Northwest Europe, some from Germany, some from Italy, you name it, that's where they kind of came from. So these Celts settled in Britain, and in this part of the world they became known as the Brigantes, the ancient Britons who resisted the Roman armies in the early years of the Christian era. So the Celts knew how to make iron, and they were skilled horsemen. They went into battle on iron wheeled kind of horse-drawn chariots attacking their enemies with iron swords and spears. So you can see how the adaptation, do you know what I mean, of the usage of materials, Stone Age, because it was predominantly stone, flint, and so forth. You know, then learning to make metals, bronze and iron. These which become progressively stronger. So with the iron, of course, we were then able to make ploughshares. You know, huge breakthroughs in terms of cultivation and farming. Absolute mongrels. But you bang on, Leslie. You know, we're all a bit of everything. You know, so I mean, there is no British. Right, it depends on who you're talking about and at what period of time you're talking about, right? That's it. It's a bit like saying Americans is you know, it's succession. Obviously, Native Americans there in the first place, you know, and then Dutch and British and German and French and all, everybody, right? Europeans, right? And then Spanish and then some, you know, Central Americans and South Americans, and yeah, this is a soup, right? We're a stew. So it seems that their kind of farmsteads, these Celts, were kind of small groups of square and rectangular fields, often enclosed by low walls of stone and gravel, and they made huts that were of wattle and daub on low kind of circular foundations of stone with thatched straw and reeds. I see a brilliant place to go if you want to see Iron Age, a place called Chichester village in Cornwall. I don't know who's been. It's on the Land's End Peninsula, and it's amazing. The only thing that puts me off slightly is there's snakes everywhere in that peninsula. Bit of coppeting done here, so I'll show you a bit more clear. So I'm not too keen on that. But otherwise, it's a wonderful place. And that has got up to, I'd say, probably about 4 or 5 foot in height, maybe even higher. Basically, the circular house of this Iron Age village, it looks like they kind of left yesterday and then a storm blew the roofs off. It is so well preserved. Chichester, I think it's called. C-H-Y and then S-A-U-S-T-E-R. I think. Google it. It's wonderful. Chichester. Beautiful. But that just shows you what an Iron Age village can look like. What a small mammoth, yeah. So we've got them up here as well, Grassington, Malham, there are these villages. Stanwick, north of Richmond. I'll try to find a good picture for Stanwick, I couldn't really find one. I thought this kind of shows, you know, what's kind of there in terms of like the height of the stones. This is an Iron Age fort. This is where we think Cartamundua, she of the foundation story of York, lived for a time. So the Brigantes were not the only Celtic tribe to occupy part of Yorkshire. In Holderness in the Wolds, East Yorkshire, there's a tribe named the Parisi. And their name is believed, of course, to stem from the Parisians, same tribe. And they come from Belgium and were present when the first Roman soldiers crossed the Humber. So the Roman soldiers crossed the Humber to kind of settle this territorial dispute that's kind of breaking out between various kind of tribals, chiefs, because the Romans like to kind of control everything by keeping the local people in charge, but kind of charging a ransom, if you like, you know, to you know, getting a slice of being allowed to scoop what resources they wanted while they were there. When these kind of territorial battles would break out, the Romans would come along and knock heads together. So that's what kind of brought them over here to the Humber. So there was only a sort of dozen or so. I seen East Anglia. I mean, I don't know how far they've got down to your part of the world, Leslie, because that's famous Boudica. You know, and the great uproar rising against the Romans in AD 60, I think, or something like that. But I mean, they've been here for centuries. That's the kind of point I'm trying to make. And they're a very organised society with kind of rules, equestrian skills, and in the Brigantes, they allow them to kind of rule over huge areas of kind of northern Britain. Often the horse motif. So when we find evidence of sort of artifacts from them, we see horses are used because obviously that was Chichester. Thank you, Leslie. That was an incredibly important form of kind of transport for them, but also military. And going back to where we kind of started, you know, it is then from this chap here, Tacitus, that kind of tells us about Cartamunda and Venetius and starts to give his snidey kind of perspective on these people who, in one way or another, you know, either directly represented or had kind of supplanted people that had lived here for thousands of years. So that's kind of, you know, what I thought would be kind of interesting to cover. We're on the hour now, aren't we? To think about not just, you know, Yorkshire as in it's great Yorkshire, it's a white flag and a white rose. Oh, that's great. I'm not against that. And use it to promote tourism. Fine, perfect. But there isn't such a thing really as a Yorkshire identity if we're going to just start with our understanding of, you know, the people that were here 2,000 years ago, not them before. Now, the difference is that before Tacitus came and wrote this stuff down, there was no written language. No written language. But what we've got is names. particularly place names, river names. So if you think about Celtic names, the River Aire, the Calder, the Don, the Nid, the Wharf, they're not Swale or the Ure, they're Danish names. The British Kingdom of Elmet, whose capital was a place named Leodis, the former, the forerunner of modern Leeds, stretching the foothills of the Pennines to the Humber Fens. So basically, northern Britain was the Kingdom of Elmet, what later became the West Riding. Places like Barwick and Elmet, Sherburn and Elmet here are kind of reminders of this ancient kingdom. And so after all this, the ice, the meltwater, the tundra, the forests, the megafauna, the hunters, the first farmers, the builders of barrows and standing stones, the Celts and their hill forts return to this place, Askham Bog. It looks peaceful now, if of course rather parched. A patch of wetland on the edge of a city, a quiet refuge of reeds, birch and alder. But it's one of the oldest surviving landscapes in Yorkshire. Beneath this surface lies a continuous record of the last 15,000 years. Layer upon layer of peat, pollen, charcoal and sediment, preserving the story of every shift of the climate, every change in vegetation, every human presence. The Mesolithic hunters who came here knew this place as a vast wetland stretching across the Vale of York. They camped on the dry islands and the higher ground, gathered plants on the margins, fished in the pools like I just showed you a minute ago, and streams, and burned patches of woodland to shape the landscape to suit their needs. Later, Neolithic farmers passed through, clearing small areas of forest. Bronze Age and Iron Age communities moved across the higher ground to the west. And so the bog remained, growing, accumulating, remembering. Askham Bog is not just a nature reserve, it's a survivor, a fragment of an ancient world that's outlasted every culture that has lived around it. When you walk here, you walk across a landscape that Mesolithic people would still recognise. The plants, the wet hollows, the quiet. These are echoes of a Yorkshire that existed long before farms, long before towns, long before written history. And that's the point of this story. Yorkshire is often about heritage, about the familiar markers of identity. But the real depth of Yorkshire lies far beneath that, in places like this, where the land keeps its own memory. Askham Bog reminds us that our history does not begin with the Romans, or the Vikings, or the Normans. It begins here, in the wetlands and woodlands of the Mesolithic, in the lives of people who shaped the land long before it had a name. This place is a doorway into that world. And when you stand here at the edge of 10,000 years of human story, still present, still alive, still part of Yorkshire today. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my tour, my story, for want of a better description, for Yorkshire. I do hope you enjoyed it. So there was something there about Barwick and Elmet. So let's have a look what that was minutes ago. Was that David? Oh, Julie. Hello, Julie. My late dad liked Barwick and Elmet, detailed leaves. Yeah, so Elmet, Kingdom of Elmet basically covered all across northern England. So as I say, we have to be very, very careful that whose history, whose narrative do we adopt when we talk about our own story? Do we allow the Romans to take that story and say, this is what the people of Northern Britain was like? Do we allow Tacitus, show it one more time, to tell us what Britain was like? Or do we say, thank you, that's very interesting, we take that on board, but we can also look at the artefacts. We can look at the discoveries, we can look at the archaeology, and we can kind of figure it out for ourselves with some help from historians, and hopefully some help from stories like this that allow you to realise that all that time separates us, is time. But these are the places, these are the lands where these people 10,000 years ago would have been seeking food, trying to get a nice life for themselves and their family. There's nothing much else that separates us. If we're kind of open-minded, if we understand that we all come from the same root, and that root is called humanity. But of course, if we seek division, divide us, what separates us, that'll keep us unhappy for a bit, but we'll always have this yearning sense of this idea of being part of something bigger, something we can belong to, something can nourish us. And that to me is kind of shared humanity. So there we go. Thank you, Leslie. Yes, remember, if you can tip, that'd be great. I mean, I'm not live, not come a long way today. But of course, I spent a good few hours researching and writing, putting together today's presentation, which I hope you enjoyed. I hope it felt a bit different. As I say, I could have gone to York and gone, it's Yorkshire Day, here's York, blah, blah, blah. But I thought, no, I want to do something a bit more interesting, because I don't think I've ever really spoken about the Stone Age period in York and Yorkshire. And it seemed with the bog reopening, it just sort of felt like it was the right time to. So we'll have one last little foray into the woodland for those that joined late and didn't perhaps miss it. I was going to nature reserve for my birthday later on this month. Julie, well, if you do, if you find the way out, I don't live too far away, drop me a note, and if I'm free, I'll come and join you. If I'd be welcome, of course. So again, we'll have a last little glimpse. I think it's important to think about this era, Tish, because as I say, it just trips so easily off the tongue. 2,000 years history, you see it everywhere in York. And it only makes sense if you say our history. It's a bit like, I tell you what, the other really good one is, and anybody British will get this, 1066. Kings and Queens is 1066. As if we didn't have kings and queens before 1066. Of course we did. But that didn't suit the narrative, because in 1066, people came and they won a battle, a conquest, and they got to write the history. So kings and queens before 1066, who cares? From now on, we've got kings and queens from 1066. And this to me is another egregious example of this. This 2,000 years of history is 2,000 years when the Romans came along and said, right, this is ours, is not the same as saying that is the history of human settlement. It's not. It's somewhere between 10 and 11,000 years. As the glaciers retreated, it got warmer, and we followed the animals that were finding new grazing land, and we in turn followed the prey to places we could eat. Thank you, Janie, that's very, very kind. So there we go. That's my tour for today. I'll just give a spin round so you can see me in these earwoods. I've been fighting this bright sunlight all the way around, but hopefully you've enjoyed the dappled lights coming through. It's an absolutely lovely place to be, and I'm delighted it's reopened. I'd encourage anybody that's able to come down and have a look for themselves. But hopefully by the time you come, they'll be a bit wetter, because you really should see it as it is. You shouldn't be able to hear crisp underfoot. You hear like that, and be thinking you're going to lose your shoes. That's what Askham Bog should be like. So hopefully by the autumn we'll be back something close to that. So thank you, everybody. Marianne didn't say hello, did I? It is, Fran, you're absolutely right. History is told from the perspective of the victor, and justifies their ways, doesn't it? This is what they are doing in order to bring civilization to the barbarians. We use words like barbarians, don't we? We don't like pagans. What's a pagan? Somebody who doesn't believe in Christianity. No, we don't get Christians, but we tend to put names, often derogatory or defamatory names, don't we, on the people that have we have vanquished, or we call them witches, don't we? Or whatever, heathens. We don't respect them. We don't tend to treat them with their culture with respect. Ours is a superior one. It must be because we're God on our side and we won. It's this kind of history of determinism, as you might say. It's historic inevitability, which is pure bunkum. Never buy into it, but of course there's always those that will tell you the eventual triumph, of so-and-so, is because it was meant to be. They had goodness and righteousness on their side. All that stuff. Leave that to the propagandists and the headline writers. Anybody that has got any truck whatsoever with history or archaeology knows that it's not worth the paper it's been done. But anyway, I digress once more than a trifle. And have a great weekend. Yes, thank you, Casey. I'm glad you enjoyed it too. And thank you for your ongoing support as ever. I'll see you all very, very soon. Bye-bye.